My name is Marcus Webb, and I am going to tell you the most ridiculous, maddening, deeply satisfying story of my entire 41 years on this earth. It started 3 years ago when my wife Priya and I bought our house at 14 Sycamore Lane in Maplewood Estates, a quiet little suburb about 30 minutes outside of Columbus, Ohio. We had been apartment people our whole lives, first in college, then through our 20s when money was tight, then through our early 30s when we were both building our careers. Priya is a physical therapist. I work in IT project management for a mid-sized logistics company. We are boring, responsible, normal people who pay our taxes on time and wave hello to our neighbors and return shopping carts to the cart return, instead of leaving them in the middle of the parking lot like some kind of feral animal. When we finally decided to buy a house, we were excited in that specific way that only first-time homebuyers understand. Every little detail felt magical. The way the morning light came through the kitchen window, the sound of the wood floors creaking in that old houseway, the backyard, which was a solid quarter-acre of mostly flat grass with 2 big oak trees at the back edge, felt like a kingdom to us after years of apartment balconies and shared laundry rooms. We did our due diligence. We read through the HOA documents, or at least I thought I did. Listen, those documents are written by lawyers specifically so that normal human beings cannot understand them. It was 47 pages of the most dense, circular, jargon-filled legal language I had ever seen. I am in project management. I read contracts for fun, and I still could not make it through page 12 without my eyes glazing over like a donut. So I skimmed it, I told myself it was fine, and I signed on the dotted line. That was my first mistake. Our realtor, a cheerful woman named Bate who always smelled like cinnamon and optimism, had mentioned in passing that the neighborhood had an HOA. She described it as pretty standard, mostly just keeps people from painting their houses neon yellow. You know how it is. I nodded. I did know how it was, or I thought I did. What Bate did not tell me, what I suspect Bate deliberately did not tell me because she wanted her commission, was that the HOA at Maplewood Estates was currently under the iron control of one Diane Holloway, who had been the HOA president for 11 consecutive years, and who ran the place less like a neighborhood organization and more like a small autocratic state. We met Diane on our 4th day in the house. We had just finished unpacking the last boxes, and Priya had set out some of her mother's old decorative pots on the front porch. Nothing crazy, 3 terracotta pots with some petunias in them, arranged near the front steps. They looked nice, welcoming, the kind of thing that makes a house look like people actually live in it and love it. I was in the garage organizing tools when I heard a knock at the door. Priya answered it. I came through the garage door into the kitchen just in time to hear a voice say, in that very particular tone that some people have, the tone that is technically polite, but is actually the verbal equivalent of a slap. I just wanted to introduce myself and go over a few things with you about community standards. I walked to the front door. Diane Holloway was about 55 years old, with short silver blonde hair cut very precisely, like every strand had been individually placed and warned not to move. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse and khaki slacks and sensible shoes, and she was holding a clipboard. She had the kind of face that might have been pretty once, but had settled into a permanent expression of mild disapproval, like she had just smelled something unpleasant and was too polite to say so. You must be the husband, she said, looking me up and down. Marcus Webb, I said, extending my hand. Nice to meet you. She shook it briefly, the way you shake hands with someone when you want to technically fulfill the social obligation, but communicate that you find the whole exercise beneath you. Then she looked past me at the pots on the porch. I see you've already started decorating, she said. Just a few pots, Priya said, smiling that patient smile she uses with difficult patients. We wanted to brighten the place up a bit. Diane pulled a sheet from her clipboard and held it out. Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the Maplewood Estates HOA Community Standards Guide covers exterior decorative elements. Pots and planters on front-facing surfaces are allowed in groups of no more than 2 and must conform to a color palette approved by the Architecture and Aesthetics Committee. You have 3 pots, and these terracotta pieces have not been approved. You have 30 days to rectify this before fines begin accruing. She smiled when she said it. That was the thing I noticed. She smiled like she was doing us a favor. We just moved in 4 days ago, I said. The rules apply from day one of occupancy, she said pleasantly. I am sure you understand. Welcome to Maplewood Estates. I do hope you will be happy here. And she turned and walked back down the path to the sidewalk, clipboard under her arm, sensible shoes clicking on the pavement, smiling to herself. Priya and I looked at each other. Well, Priya said. Yeah, I said. We moved one of the pots to the back porch. I told myself it was just an adjustment period. Every neighborhood has its quirks. I would read the HOA rules properly this time. We would figure it out. I did not figure it out. Chapter 2, The Year of 1,000 Violations. Over the next 12 months, Diane Holloway sent us 19 formal violation notices. I am not exaggerating, 19. I have them in a folder. I kept every single one of them, which will become important later in this story. Let me walk you through some of the greatest hits. Violation number 3 was about our mailbox. Apparently, the approved mailbox style for Maplewood Estates was a very specific colonial-style black metal box that cost $65 from a specific vendor that, I am sure entirely by coincidence, was owned by the brother-in-law of the HOA treasurer. The previous owners had left us a perfectly functional, perfectly normal, neutral-colored standard mailbox. It was a mailbox. It held mail. But it was, according to Diane, non-compliant with Section 7, Paragraph 4, and we had 30 days. We bought the approved mailbox, $65. Violation number 6 was about our lawn. I had let the grass get to about 3.5 inches before I mowed it, because it had rained all week, and the lawn was too wet to cut safely. Diane's citation said HOA rules required grass not to exceed 3 inches, half an inch. I got a formal violation for half an inch of grass. Violation number 8 was about my truck. I drive a 2018 Ford F-150. It is clean, it is not loud, it is not leaking oil, it is not ugly. But it was parked in my own driveway, and apparently commercial-looking vehicles and trucks with visible toolboxes or equipment, which mine did not even have, were restricted from driveway parking under some interpretation of Section 11 that I am still not sure was actually in the original document. I told Diane my truck did not have any commercial markings. She said the truck itself looked commercial by its nature. I said that was not a real rule. She sent me a second notice 3 days later. I started parking it in the garage. Violation number 11 was the one that really got to me. My daughter Lily was 6 years old and in first grade, and she had painted a rock in her class, a smooth oval rock, about the size of a grapefruit, painted like a ladybug, with googly eyes glued on. She was so proud of that rock. She carried it home in her backpack like it was treasure. She wanted to put it in the garden by the front steps, next to the one remaining approved pot that we had been allowed to keep. Diane sent us a notice about the rock within 48 hours. I am going to say that again. Within 48 hours, Diane Holloway had walked past our house, spotted my first grader's painted ladybug rock, determined it was a violation of Section 4, Paragraph 7, regarding decorative yard ornaments not pre-approved by the Architecture and Aesthetics Committee, and taken the time to type up and deliver a formal violation notice. I had to explain to Lily that the rock had to go. I tried to make it gentle. I told her we would put it in the backyard where it would be safe. She cried. She was 6 years old, and she cried over her ladybug rock because of Diane Holloway's clipboard. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not rage, exactly, something colder and more patient than rage. A decision. I am not going to let this woman win. Here is the thing about people like Diane Holloway. They count on you giving up. They count on the intimidation of formal language and the tedium of fighting bureaucracy wearing you down until you just comply and stop pushing back. Most people do exactly that. They get a notice, they feel anxious about it, they fix whatever Diane has decided is a problem, and they go back to their lives. Diane has been doing this for 11 years because that system has worked for 11 years. But I am an IT project manager. My entire career is built on understanding systems, finding where they are weak, and building better processes. I read documentation for a living. complex, technical, deeply boring documentation, and I am very, very good at it. So I did something I should have done before I signed the purchase agreement. I read the entire HOA rulebook, all 47 pages. Then I read the state statutes for homeowners associations in Ohio. Then I joined 3 online forums for HOA reform advocates. Yes, those exist. There are whole communities of people who have been through exactly what I was going through, and I started learning. What I learned was illuminating. First, I learned that our HOA had not held a proper annual election in 4 years. Diane had been re-elected, each time through a vote that was held with less than the quorum required by both the HOA bylaws and Ohio state law, which meant, technically, her presidency might not even be legally valid. Second, I learned that 3 of the fines we had paid, yes, we had paid some fines before I got smart, were assessed under provisions of the rules that had never been formally voted on by the full HOA board. They had been added to an internal enforcement document by Diane unilaterally. They were not in the original documents we signed at closing. Third, and this is the one that really opened my eyes, Ohio law requires that HOA fines be assessed in a specific process that includes written notice, a reasonable cure period, and the right to a hearing before the full board before any fine becomes legally collectible. Diane had been skipping the hearing step entirely. She had been sending notices, waiting 30 days, and then just adding fines to homeowners' accounts. That was not legal. I started writing everything down, every notice, every date, every amount. I created a spreadsheet. I documented the timeline of every interaction we had had with Diane and with the HOA board. I took photographs of our property at regular intervals so I had a visual record of its condition. I became, in other words, absolutely insufferable about paperwork. Priya watched all of this with a mixture of amusement and concern. "You're becoming one of those people," she said one evening, looking at my growing folder of HOA documents. "What people?" I said. "The ones who go to HOA meetings and say, 'I'd like to raise a point of order.'" "Someone has to," I said. She laughed and brought me a cup of tea and did not try to stop me, because Priya is a wonderful person who understands that when I decide to do something, the most efficient path forward is to let me do it. I attended the next HOA meeting, and the one after that, and the one after that. The meetings were held monthly in the clubhouse near the community pool. They were usually attended by Diane, the 3 other board members who all did exactly what Diane said, a couple of elderly residents who came mostly for the free coffee, and sometimes 1 or 2 other homeowners with specific complaints that Diane would listen to with patient condescension and then table indefinitely. When I showed up the first time, Diane acknowledged me with a nod and a smile and said she was glad to see new residents taking an interest in community governance. I smiled back. I was taking notes. By the 3rd meeting, I had started asking questions. Polite questions, specific questions, questions like, "Could you point me to the board resolution that authorized the mailbox vendor requirement?" And, "I noticed the minutes from the last annual election don't reflect the quorum count. Could you share those records?" And, "I wanted to confirm the proper hearing procedure under our bylaws. I want to make sure I understand it correctly." Diane's smile got a little tighter each time. The other board members started looking at each other. I was not causing a scene. I was not being rude. I was being exactly as friendly and procedurally correct as Diane had always been with us. It was, I will admit, deeply satisfying. Chapter 4: The Fence That Started the War. Now all of that was the slow burn background, the legal research, the meeting attendance, the documentation. That was me playing the long game. But the real war, the war that led to the cinder block fortress, started with something much simpler. A fence. Our backyard was unfenced. In a neighborhood with kids and dogs, an unfenced yard is basically an invitation for every golden retriever in the zip code to use your lawn as a bathroom and for every child's ball to end up under your oak trees. We wanted a fence. A nice, normal, wooden privacy fence around the backyard. 6 feet tall cedar, the kind you see in literally every suburb in America. I did everything right. I submitted the formal application to the HOA Architecture and Aesthetics Committee, which I had discovered by this point was a committee that in practice consisted entirely of Diane and whoever she happened to call the day before a decision was needed. I submitted drawings, material specifications, a site plan, the contractor's license information, and a letter explaining exactly what we wanted and why. I submitted it 6 weeks before we needed to start construction because the HOA bylaws gave them 30 days to respond. 45 days later, I had received no response. I sent a follow-up email, no response. I sent a certified letter, no response. I showed up at the next HOA meeting and raised it as a floor item. Diane said the committee was still reviewing the application and would respond in due course. At this point, I want to mention something important that I had learned from my HOA research forums. In Ohio, if an HOA fails to respond to an architectural application within their own stated review period, the application is generally considered approved by default under the principle that an organization cannot benefit from its own procedural failures. I knew this. I had confirmed it with a real estate attorney I had consulted, just a 1-hour consultation, about $150, which I considered the best investment I had made since buying the house. I sent Diane a letter, certified mail, return receipt requested, informing her that as the committee had failed to respond within the 30-day period specified in Section 8, Paragraph 3 of the HOA bylaws, I was treating the application as approved by default and would be beginning construction on the stated start date. She called me the next morning. "Mr. Webb," she said, in a voice that was very controlled and very cold, "I want to make sure you understand that constructing any structure without formal committee approval is a violation of HOA rules and will result in significant fines and a demand for removal at your expense." "Diane," I said, in my friendliest voice, "I want to make sure you understand that I have documentation showing the application was submitted 6 weeks ago, that your 30-day review window has passed, and that under both our bylaws and Ohio HOA statutes, my application is approved by default. I have a letter from a real estate attorney confirming this interpretation. I will be starting construction on Thursday. Thank you for calling." And I hung up. She sent me a violation notice that afternoon. I filed it in my folder. We started building the fence on Thursday. The fence went up over a weekend. My contractor, a guy named Pete who had done about 1,000 residential fences and had seen every flavor of HOA drama possible, was unbothered by the whole situation. "Lady knocks on my door, I just smile and keep working," he told me. "I got my permits from the city. HOA doesn't sign my license." The fence looked great. Solid cedar, good clean line, 6 feet tall. Lily immediately loved it because it made the backyard feel like a private world. She spent the first Saturday after it went up out there with her chalk, drawing on the boards, and calling the whole thing her castle wall. Diane sent us 3 violation notices about the fence over the following 2 weeks. I responded to each one in writing, attaching my documentation about the default approval, the certified mail receipts, and the attorney's letter. Each response was polite, thorough, and completely impenetrable. I was speaking her language now, bureaucratic procedure applied with absolute precision. She could not make the fence come down. But she was not finished. Over the next 6 weeks, Diane turned up the pressure in every other direction she could find. She had someone, I strongly suspected it was her, though I could never prove it, call the city building department and report that our fence might not have a proper permit. The building inspector came out, reviewed our permits, and left. Everything was fine. She sent notices about the length of our grass twice in 1 month. I mowed. I sent photo documentation with timestamps. She sent a notice about the color of our front door. We had painted it a deep navy blue when we moved in, which I thought looked sharp, and which Diane now claimed was not on the approved exterior color palette. I pulled the palette document from my closing files. Navy blue was listed. I sent her the page with the color highlighted. She brought up the fence at the next HOA meeting, asking the board to vote on a formal demand for removal. I came to that meeting with my folder. I walked through the documentation step by step. Two of the board members, a retired couple named Walt and Shirley Eberhardt, who had started talking to me after meetings, looked visibly uncomfortable during Diane's presentation. The vote to demand removal failed 2-2, with Diane and one other board member voting for it and Walt and Shirley abstaining. Under the bylaws, a failed motion meant no action. After the meeting, Walt Eberhardt caught up with me in the parking lot. He was a quiet man in his late 60s with a grey mustache and the careful walk of someone who had had a hip replacement. "You're the first person in 4 years who's pushed back like this," he said. "She doesn't know what to do with you." "Good," I said. He shook his head slowly, but he was smiling. "Just be careful. When Diane gets backed into a corner, she doesn't back down. She finds another door." He was right, and the door she found next was a wall. Chapter 6: The Property Line Problem. Here is where the story takes a turn that I did not see coming. In the spring of the second year, I decided I wanted to expand our small back patio. Nothing grand, just pour a concrete extension, add some pavers, put up a pergola, make it a nice outdoor space for summer evenings. Priya had been wanting an outdoor dining area since we moved in. I got a contractor quote, drew up rough plans, and submitted another formal application to the committee, this time determined to follow every single procedure to the letter so Diane would have no grounds to reject it. During the permitting process with the city, the contractor asked me to confirm my property survey because he needed exact boundary measurements for the permit application. I dug out the survey from my closing documents. Standard stuff, plat map, legal description, boundary markers. And I noticed something. Our property line on the north side, the side that bordered Diane Holloway's property, was different from what I had assumed. The survey showed our lot extending approximately 4 feet further north than the existing wooden boundary markers suggested. Those markers, the little metal stakes in the ground that I had always assumed were official, were not on the actual legal boundary. They were about 4 feet inside our property. I looked at the survey again, then I looked at the markers, then I walked the line myself with a measuring tape and the coordinates from the survey. Those 4 feet were ours, had always been ours. The previous owners must have placed those markers incorrectly, or maybe Diane had moved them at some point. I could not prove that, and I am not accusing her of it, but I will note that Diane had been a neighbor long enough to know where the real line was. And that 4-foot strip along the entire length of the property line was about 60 feet long, meaning roughly 240 square feet of our property that we had never been using. More importantly, Diane had a garden bed along what she believed was her property edge. A long, narrow, raised bed with some ornamental grasses and bushes that was, according to the legal survey, entirely within our property. I sat on this information for 2 weeks, thinking carefully about what to do with it. I consulted with the attorney again. She confirmed my reading of the survey and told me that under Ohio property law, I had the right to my full surveyed property. She advised me to get a formal licensed surveyor to restake the corners, which would create a legal record before taking any action. She also told me very carefully that I should document everything I did and that I should communicate in writing, not verbally, with Diane about any property boundary issues. I hired the surveyor. The new stakes went in on a Tuesday morning. I had not told Diane this was happening. I had no legal obligation to warn her. The surveyor was professional, efficient, and placed bright orange flagged metal stakes exactly at the legal boundary of our property. The new stakes were 4 feet north of where the old markers had been. They were positioned along the entire length of the boundary, and 2 of them were on the south side of Diane Holloway's garden bed. Meaning her garden bed was now, officially and on legal record, sitting on my property. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I saw Diane walk out into her backyard, stop, look at the stakes, look at her garden, look at the stakes again, and then stand very still for about 30 seconds in the way that people do when their brain is processing something it does not want to accept. Then she walked back inside. She called me 20 minutes later. I did not answer. She left a voicemail saying there must be some mistake with the survey stakes and that she wanted to discuss it. I texted back, "Hi Diane, happy to discuss. Please send any questions or concerns in writing to my email address. Thanks." She sent an email at 9 p.m. that night. It was 3 paragraphs long and used phrases like egregious error and decades of established boundary practice, and ended with, "I expect this to be resolved immediately." I forwarded the email to my attorney and went to bed. Chapter 7: The Offer and the Refusal. My attorney drafted a response. It was calm, factual, and attached a copy of the official survey, the surveyor's certification, and a brief explanation of Ohio property law as it applied to boundary disputes. The letter noted that the survey was legal and binding, that the stakes represented the actual property line, and that any structures or plantings currently on our property that were placed there by the adjacent property owner would need to be addressed. It did not demand that she remove her garden. Not yet. It simply established the facts and left the door open for conversation. Diane's response 3 days later was not through an attorney. It was a personal letter, handwritten, which I thought was an interesting choice. In it she explained that the garden had been there for 8 years, that she had planted and maintained it at her own expense, and that she considered it unreasonable for us to suddenly claim it as our property after all this time. She suggested we simply agree to allow the garden to remain as a gesture of good neighborly relations. I will be honest, Priya and I talked about this. Priya, who is a more generous person than I am, thought there might be a path to a reasonable agreement. Maybe we let her keep the garden and she eases up on the HOA harassment, a practical piece. I considered it, I genuinely considered it, but I also thought about Lily's Ladybug Rock, about the $65 mailbox, about the violation notice for half an inch of grass, about every single one of those 19 notices and the fines, and the way Diane had made our home feel less like a home and more like a test we could never pass. And I thought about Walt Eberhardt's words, "When Diane gets backed into a corner, she doesn't back down, she finds another door." If I let her keep that garden as a gesture of goodwill, she would take it as proof that I could be appeased, that if she applied enough pressure in enough places, I would eventually give her what she wanted to make the discomfort stop. It would never end. I wrote back through my attorney with a simple proposal. Diane could purchase that 4-foot strip of land from us at fair market value. We had it assessed. It came out to approximately $12,000 for the full strip, which was actually quite reasonable, or she could enter a formal license agreement with an annual fee. If neither of those was acceptable, we would need her to remove the garden from our property within 60 days. Diane rejected both options in a single line. "I will not be paying for land that has always been mine." 60 days, I wrote back. The clock starts now. End of Part 1. Part 1 ends here. Viewer is left on the edge. What will Marcus do when 60 days are up? And what will Diane do first? Tune into Part 2. Part 2, The Fortress Rises. Fire Part 2 Hook, 15 SECONDS. Last time I told you how Diane Holloway spent 11 years bullying everyone in Maplewood Estates, how she turned our home into a war zone, one violation notice at a time, how I finally discovered she had been sitting on 4 feet of our land for 8 years. Well, today I am going to tell you what I did when she refused to leave, and I promise you, a cinder block wall was only the beginning. Chapter 8: The 60 Days. The 60-day clock ran out on a Wednesday in late September. I had not been idle during those 60 days. I had been planning. I had spent evenings at the kitchen table with graph paper and a ruler, measuring and remeasuring, consulting with contractors, calling the city permit office, reviewing setback requirements. I had a very specific project in mind, and I wanted it to be absolutely, completely, utterly, and permanently legal in every dimension. Here is what I had decided to do with that 4-foot strip of property. I was going to build a wall. Not a fence, not a hedge, not a row of shrubs that could be trimmed or disputed. A wall, a real wall made of solid concrete cinder blocks, mortared together, 6 feet tall, sitting exactly on the legal property line as established by the licensed surveyor, running the full 60-foot length of the northern boundary. Under Ohio residential building codes, A masonry wall of this type required a building permit. I applied for the permit 2 weeks before the 60-day deadline, so it would be approved and ready. Under HOA architectural guidelines, and I had read every line, annotated every section, solid masonry boundary walls were listed as an approved structure type, subject to the same approval process as fences. I submitted my application to the HOA committee with full documentation, site plan, materials list, dimensions, everything. Diane, of course, did not respond within 30 days. I had my default approval. The building permit came through, the contractor was lined up, the materials were ordered, 3 pallets of standard grey concrete cinder blocks, 2 bags of mortar per course, rebar for reinforcement, a concrete footer poured to code. My contractor, a solid guy named Darnell who ran a small masonry and concrete business and who listened to my explanation of the situation with great patience and then said, "Man, I've done HOA walls before, this is going to be fun," had scheduled the work for the Thursday after the deadline. On Tuesday, 2 days before the deadline, Diane knocked on my door. I answered it. She was holding her clipboard, but she looked different, less composed than usual. There were lines around her eyes that I had not noticed before, or maybe I had never looked closely enough. She had the air of someone who had been rehearsing a conversation and was not confident it was going to go the way she hoped. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I'd like to talk, neighbor to neighbor, no lawyers." "Of course," I said, "would you like to come in?" She shook her head slightly, so we stood in the doorway. "I understand you've received your building permits," she said. "That's right. I want to ask you, neighbor to neighbor, not to do this." She paused. "The wall you're planning will block sunlight to my garden. It will change the character of this part of the street. It is, in my opinion, an aggressive and punitive act." I thought about what to say for a moment. I thought about Lily's ladybug rock. I thought about the mailbox. I thought about the day I had found Priya in the kitchen, stress-reading the HOA rules for the 4th time that month, looking exhausted and defeated in her own home. "Diane," I said, "you had an option to purchase the land at fair market value. You had an option to enter a license agreement. You declined both. The wall is within my property, fully permitted, and architecturally approved under HOA guidelines. I'm sorry about the sunlight." She looked at me for a long moment. "I see," she said. She started to turn, then stopped. "You know, not everything has to be a fight." "I completely agree," I said. "I've believed that since the day you came to my door about our flower pots." She left without another word. The wall went up on Thursday and Friday. Chapter 9, The Walls. I want to describe the wall to you because it deserves description. Darnell and his crew poured the footer on Thursday morning, a 6-inch deep concrete strip along the full 60-foot length of the boundary, exactly on the surveyed line, not an inch inside our property, not an inch onto Diane's. They let it cure overnight. Friday morning, 5 guys showed up at 7 a.m. with the cinder blocks already staged on the pallets in our backyard. By noon, they had laid the first 4 courses, 2 feet of wall, solid gray concrete blocks, mortared with precision, straight as a laser level. Darnell was meticulous, every block checked with the level, every mortar joint clean and consistent. By Friday afternoon, the wall was 5 feet tall. 6 courses plus half a course of specialty capstones that Darnell had suggested, a slightly different profile that gave the wall a finished, intentional look at the top, rather than just a flat, raw edge. By Friday evening, the wall was done. 6 feet tall, 60 feet long, solid concrete cinder block, mortared, reinforced, capped, running along the exact legal boundary of our property as certified by a licensed surveyor and on file with the county. Diane's garden, the ornamental grasses and the bushes, the little slate stepping stone she had in the middle of it, the whole carefully tended bed, was now on the south side of our wall. The wall did not touch her garden. The wall was on our side of the property line by exactly the thickness of the foundation and the blocks themselves. Her garden, technically, remained on our land, but the wall made that point somewhat academic. I stood in the backyard Friday evening with a beer, looking at the wall. Lily came out and immediately declared it even better than the fence wall and asked if we could paint it. I told her we could think about that. Priya came out and stood next to me, and we both just looked at it for a minute. "How do you feel?" she said. "Satisfied," I said. "Very, very satisfied." She raised her glass. "To the fortress." "To the fortress," I said. Chapter 10, Diane's Counterattack. I will give Diane credit for one thing. She did not give up easily. Over the next 3 weeks, she attempted 6 different approaches to get the wall removed. First, she called the city building department and reported the wall as non-compliant. The building inspector came out, reviewed the permit, measured the wall, walked the property line, and left. The wall was fully compliant. The inspector actually told my contractor, who happened to be there that day, that it was one of the cleaner masonry jobs he had seen on a residential permit in a while. Second, she hired her own surveyor to resurvey the property line, presumably hoping to find some error in our survey. Her surveyor came out, did the work, and confirmed our survey. I know this because the results are a matter of public record. Third, she brought a formal complaint to the HOA board, alleging that the wall was a violation of community standards. I came to that meeting with my folder. I showed the board the committee application, the default approval documentation, the permit, and the section of the HOA rules that explicitly listed masonry boundary walls as an approved structure type. The board, including Walt and Shirley, who by this point were openly sympathetic to our position, voted 3-1 against Diane's complaint. Diane voted for it. Fourth, she contacted a HOA violations attorney, a real one, not just the board's general counsel. I received a letter from this attorney claiming the wall was a spite fence and therefore actionable under Ohio nuisance law. I forwarded this to my attorney, who drafted a detailed response explaining that Ohio's spite fence statute requires demonstrating that the structure has no legitimate use other than to annoy the neighbor, and that a solid masonry wall on a property boundary has obvious, documented, legitimate uses, including privacy and security. The attorney's letter also noted that the wall had been built in response to a genuine property boundary dispute, not out of spite, and attached the entire documented timeline of events. We did not hear back from Diane's attorney after that. Fifth, Diane went door to door in the neighborhood, talking to other homeowners about the wall. I know this because several of those homeowners, including Walt and Shirley, and a young couple 2 doors down named James and Fernanda Ruiz, who had their own long history of conflicts with Diane, came to tell me what she had said. She was describing me as a difficult, aggressive homeowner who was trying to destroy the community character and intimidate a 60-year-old woman with a fortress wall. James told me with barely concealed delight that when Diane made her case to him, he had listened politely and then said, "Honestly, Diane, I'm surprised it took someone this long." Sixth, and this was the most creative one, she submitted a formal complaint to the county zoning board claiming the wall exceeded the residential fence height limit for side yards. This one actually gave me a moment of pause because I had to go back and check. Under Ohio residential zoning, solid fences in side and rear yards are typically allowed up to 6 feet in most zones. Our wall was exactly 6 feet, not 6 feet 1 inch, 6 feet. I had measured it specifically. The zoning board reviewed the complaint and dismissed it. After the 6th failed attempt, Diane went quiet. Not a concession. I did not expect a concession from Diane, more like a general pulling back to regroup and reassess. The violation notices stopped. I noticed I did not see her as often in the neighborhood. At the next HOA meeting, she was quieter than usual. I tried not to gloat. I am not sure I entirely succeeded. Chapter 11, The Turning Point. The thing about a long fight is that eventually it costs too much for the people involved to continue fighting. That is true in real war, and it is true in neighborhood disputes. Diane had spent money on her attorney. She had spent political capital with the board. She had spent social goodwill in the neighborhood, much of which had already been stretched thin by 11 years of aggressive enforcement that had made her more feared than respected. And she had lost every single battle. 2 months after the wall went up, I got a call from Walt Eberhardt. He had been talking to some of the other long-term residents, he said. He thought there might be enough interest to call a special meeting of the HOA membership, which under Ohio law could be done with signatures from 15% of the membership. There were about 220 households in Maplewood Estates, so that meant 33 signatures. Walt thought he could get them. He wanted to know if I would be willing to be involved. I said yes. What followed over the next month was the most organized, careful, neighborly effort I had ever been part of. Walt and Shirley Eberhardt went door to door. James and Fernanda Ruiz worked their end of the street. I made phone calls. We were not angry. We were not aggressive. We were simply neighbors who wanted fair, transparent governance of our community and who had documented evidence that the current administration was not providing it. We got 41 signatures, well over the required 15%. The special meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the community clubhouse. About 90 homeowners showed up, which was roughly 40% of the membership, an extraordinary turnout for an HOA meeting that was normally attended by 8 people. I had put together a presentation, not inflammatory, just facts. The violation history, the procedural issues with the fines, the election quorum problems, the financial records that showed HOA funds being directed to specific vendors without competitive bidding. Diane sat in the front row with her clipboard and her tight smile and her sensible shoes, and she looked, for the first time in all of this, like someone who understood that the room had changed. The meeting lasted 2.5 hours. At the end of it, the membership voted to order a full audit of HOA finances, to require all architectural committee decisions to be made by a full 3-person committee rather than by a single person, and most significantly, to hold a new board election within 60 days, this time conducted strictly according to the quorum and procedure requirements in the bylaws. Diane did not win that election. She ran, I will give her that. She gave a speech about her record of service and her commitment to community standards. She received 21 votes. The new president, a retired teacher named Gloria Okonkwo, who had been quietly dealing with HOA problems for years and who had a calm, firm manner that everyone in the room seemed to respect immediately, received 67 votes. Diane left the election meeting before the results were formally announced. I did not feel triumphant, exactly. I felt tired and satisfied in the way you feel when you have finished a long, difficult project and it has come out well. I shook hands with Gloria, who looked at me with an expression that combined gratitude and a kind of wary respect. You built quite a file, she said. I kept everything, I said. Chapter 12, What HAPPNED 2, The Wall. The wall is still there. I want to be clear about that. I did not take it down after Diane lost the election. It is my wall. It is on my property. It is fully permitted and legally constructed. And frankly, it is a nice wall. Priya put some climbing roses along our side of it that are starting to fill in beautifully. Lily painted a mural on the lower section. She is 8 now and considerably more ambitious than Ladybug Rocks. A sprawling garden scene with flowers and a bright yellow sun and a small bird that she has named Gerald after her grandfather's garden gnome. The wall gives us privacy. It defines our space. Every time I look at it, I feel the particular satisfaction of someone who said no when saying no was hard and then built something solid and permanent to prove they meant it. Diane Holloway still lives next door. We do not have a warm relationship. We nod when we pass each other on the street, the way neighbors do when there is a history that neither person wants to revisit every single morning. Her garden on our side of the wall, the ornamental grasses, the bushes, the little slate stone, is technically still there. We have not pressed the issue since the election. Gloria asked me, shortly after taking over as president, whether I intended to pursue the garden situation, and I told her honestly that as long as things stayed civil, I had no need to. It was my land, but I was not using it, and I had made my point more than sufficiently. The 19 violation notices are still in my folder. I will probably keep them forever, the way you keep things that were hard but made you stronger. The Ladybug Rock is still in the backyard. Lily upgraded it recently. She repainted it and added a little stone pathway leading to it, which she says the ladybug uses when it walks home. Chapter 13, What I Learned. I want to end this with something honest, because I think a lot of people watching this might have their own Diane Holloways in their neighborhood or in their workplace or wherever people who love power over others tend to set up shop. Here is what I learned. Documentation is power. Every notice I kept, every certified letter I sent, every date I wrote down, all of that became the architecture of my defense and eventually my offense. People who abuse procedural authority count on the fact that the people they target won't document things carefully, won't read the rules as carefully as they do, won't know their own rights. Close that gap and you close most of their advantage. The rules apply to everyone. Diane used the HOA rules as a weapon against residents for 11 years because no one ever used those same rules back at her. The rules about quorum requirements and election procedures and committee composition, those existed the whole time. I just bothered to read them. Patience wins, not patience in the sense of tolerating abuse without response, patience in the sense of playing a longer game than your opponent. Diane was reactive and emotional. She escalated quickly, and her escalations were often overreaches that created legal exposure. I tried to be deliberate and strategic, not always easy, but usually more effective. And finally, sometimes you just need to build a wall. Not metaphorically, literally. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is build something solid and permanent and legal that says, "This is mine, I know it, and there is nothing you can do about it." The cinder block fortress stands. Epilogue. 6 months after the election, Gloria Okonkwo called a special session of the new HOA board to review all outstanding violations. Of the 43 open violation cases against residents in the community, 31 were dismissed outright as either improperly issued or as applying rules that had never been formally adopted by the full board. The remaining 12 were reduced to courtesy notices with no financial penalties. The mailbox vendor requirement was eliminated entirely. The exterior color palette was expanded and the approval process simplified. The fine assessment procedure was overhauled to comply with Ohio state law. Our HOA dues went down by $8 a month. James and Fernanda Ruiz had a barbecue to celebrate. Walt and Shirley came. Gloria came. Lily spent the whole evening running between the backyard and the fence wall and the new climbing roses. At one point in the evening, standing with a plate of food and looking at our backyard in the late summer light, Priya said, "We turned out to be pretty good at this homeownership thing." I looked at the wall, at the roses, at Lily laughing at something James had said, at our home.